Goodbye Eeri is a story about a lot of things. It's about finding meaning in your life through art, about how we cope with failure and loss, and about a person's struggle to understand the trauma that he suffered through all his life. It touches on a lot of subjects and can be read in many different ways, but I wanted to talk specifically about its use of narratives and its commentary on how we build up narratives about the people we know, and how we create an incomplete image of who they are, and then filter their actions through that understanding of them, leading us to excuse the bad and amplify the good in the people we care for. How desperate people can cling on to others and idealize them to an unhealthy extent. And I want to talk about how the story presents the harm that can come from doing that, and how it can have a really lasting impact on people's lives. That being said, let's begin. We start with our protagonist, Yuta, seemingly living an idyllic life with his loving parents. We see them all celebrating his 12th birthday and his parents gifting him the new smartphone, which he uses to film the entire thing. Everything seems like it's going perfectly, until his mother gently reminds him of the illness that's afflicting her, the one which could kill her. Yuta says that he'd rather not talk about that on his birthday, but his mom continues and asks him if he wouldn't mind filming her on his camera, so that if she does die, he'll have something to remember her by. Seeing how much this means to her, Yuta accepts, despite his discomfort. We follow the story through the footage that Yuta is taking in order to fulfill his mom's wish, and what we see is a house filled with warmth and happiness, but also one that's haunted by this disease. Soon, for every happy memory that Yuta records, there's another where his family is fearful and heartbroken, as his mum's condition worsens and their hope slips away more and more, until we see Yuta and his father arriving at the hospital, with his mum on the verge of death, wanting only for Yuta to come and see her, to be with her, and to film her last moments. He begins to walk up to the hospital, shaking, and then he stops. He can't do it, it's too much to bear, so he runs away. And it's at that moment that the hospital explodes. The scene pans out, and we see that this is all part of a film that an older Yuta is premiering at the school festival. His mother really did die when he was 12, and all the footage, barring the explosion, is genuine. However, he's edited it all together in order to build up a really moving tribute to his mum, only to then squander that completely by adding a random explosion at the end. And it just feels so disrespectful, like he's making a complete mockery of his mum's death. And when he's questioned about why he did this, all he can answer is that it's because, well, explosions are awesome, aren't they? And by this point, both the reader and the other characters in the story are thinking that Yuta is some kind of psychopath or a complete arsehole to make something like this, and his classmates lambast him for how bad and morally reprehensible the film was. But Yuta doesn't really act like how a disrespectful arse would. Instead of shrugging it off or getting angry, he's completely distraught, and the mockery drives him to consider suicide. He goes up to the roof of a hospital and thinks about jumping off when a girl calls out to him. She seems not too worried at first, but then she realizes that he was the one who made the film that was shown to class earlier, and immediately she tells him to follow her, and they go to an abandoned house where they then proceed to watch a bunch of movies. Yuta is about as confused as the reader by this, and he asks her what on earth is going on, at which point the girl, who reveals her name as Eeri, tells him that his film resonated deeply with her, but she was pissed as hell that nobody else understood it. They all mocked it without thinking about what it really might have been saying. At the same time though, she never really specifies about what she means by this, or why the film meant so much to her. Rather, she tells Yuta that she wants him to study the art of filmmaking so he can make another film, one that this time will make everyone in their school bawl their eyes out, as the perfect revenge. We see the first hints of narrative as a theme beginning at this point. Yuta's classmates have taken his film and used it to construct a narrative about him, that he's this totally shameless jerk, willing to mock his own mother for kicks. This narrative is both completely untrue and completely understandable. The way that Yuta himself has presented this information does appear to make him quite horrible. However, they are making a judgment of him without ever fully understanding what he was actually trying to say, distorting him in their minds until they created an entirely different Yuta. And though it isn't immediately obvious, the theme of filtering someone through your perspective until they become a stranger to the real them is a theme which will repeat itself over and over throughout the story. We spend the next chapter watching Eeri and Yuta's friendship growing, but also Yuta's repeated attempts to write a script which will resonate in the same way that his last film did. And this chapter feels very fun, especially in comparison to the previous ones. Even though Eeri is kinda harsh in her judgment of Yuta's scripts, overall the two seem to be just really enjoying each other's company a lot. And it's really nice to see Yuta being able to actually relax and enjoy himself around a friend. We watch a montage of their reactions to different movies, sometimes laughing to the point of tears, and then sometimes just being completely unimpressed. And it's really funny and gets across their friendship very well and very quickly. Despite taking place in the short space of a single chapter, the growth of their friendship feels very real and comes off naturally. They start having all these little jokes and instances of friendly teasing that develop just like how it does in real life. And that really gets the reader invested in these characters, even more so than before. But it's also in these scenes that the presentation style really shines. Almost the entire manga is shown from the viewpoint of Yuta's camera, which immediately puts us in Yuta's headspace, since we're mostly seeing the world through his eyes. We experience everything that he experiences, in the same way that he experienced, and it makes it so that we are completely immersed in Yuta's subjective perspective of the world. It also means that our viewpoints are fixed in place for the entirety of a single scene, which often leaves very little movement in between panels. This sounds almost lazy at first, but it has a very deliberate purpose. In between panels, the characters' expressions will often shift slightly from moment to moment, creating a really smooth flow to the conversation as you see the tiny ways in which they react to everything that's being said. This makes the manga surprisingly expressive and prevents it from ever feeling repetitive or visually uninteresting, since every panel gives us a new detail to notice and makes it just so much more personal, because every little change in a character's face or posture is something that we understand alongside Yuta, further putting us in his shoes. Not only that, but it helps Yuta to be a more relatable character, because during the more upsetting moments, even when he doesn't have dialogue, we can tell that he's feeling just as gutted as we are, because of the extent to which our understanding of these events are tied to his. And in the presentation style, the story uses silence incredibly well. Often you'll have panels with no dialogue at all, just letting you soak in what's been said in the previous panel, or letting the subtle shifts in characters' expressions tell you all that you need to know. There are even long strings of silent panels, which seem to have very little going on at all, but which nonetheless help build up a very particular atmosphere. Like in this scene, which has Yuta and Eeri eating dinner with Yuta's dad, and the manga spends 12 panels resting on Yuta's view of them all eating dinner in silence. And without anything being obviously wrong, it just builds up this feeling of tension and awkwardness before Yuta's dad quietly tells Eeri that he's not comfortable with the pressure that this movie is putting Yuta under, and growing more and more angry until he yells at Eeri to get out of his house and never to speak to Yuta again. And though a technique like resting on a shot for an awkward amount of time would be something done often in film, I don't think that I've ever seen something like this done in a manga. And it makes Goodbye Eeri feel so unique, and makes the sadder story beats hit so much harder, because you aren't immediately given Yuta's reaction to distract you from how it made you personally feel. You have to pause for a moment and just take it all in, just like Yuta is. Again, it gives you a really good understanding of how Yuta feels in most scenes, because you are feeling the exact same thing, without even needing any dialogue whatsoever. All of this is so important, not just because it makes the manga more engaging, but also because through getting you into Yuta's headspace and pacing all of the events out so that you experience them at the same time as he does, it solidly puts you into Yuta's narrative of the world, filtered through what makes sense to him and helps you empathize with him more. Eventually, after not being able to think of a screenplay that properly resonates, Yuta just asks Eeri what it was that she really liked about his film, and she tells him that it was the way that he subverted expectation, how he built up his mom as this kind and loving person, but then also had her pressuring her own son into filming her slow deterioration and death. All throughout the film, everybody was set up to feel bad for the mom, while Yuta was struggling like hell with that expectation in the background. And because of how unfair his mom's demand was, when Yuta ran away from the hospital defying that wish, Eeri says that it felt so cathartic to watch, and while the others were disgusted by him, she sympathized with Yuta's position. Eeri continues by telling him that she wants to see his story, not something that's been heavily inspired by some other piece of fiction, just something that's deeply personal to Yuta and Yuta alone, in the same way that his first movie was. After mulling this over, Yuta decides to make a film based on his own life again, this time following a story that we ourselves have been watching this entire time, about Eeri helping Yuta to find passion for filmmaking again, but this time with one major expectation. In this, Eeri is actually a dying vampire who wants Yuta to turn her last days into a film so that she can leave behind some kind of legacy and to be part of something beautiful. At the same time, Yuta's character is racked by the guilt of not being able to film his mum's death, And so, filming Eeri is his way of making up for that and finally getting closure. Yuta's character obviously bears a great resemblance to him, and so having his character feel guilty can be taken to mean that Yuta himself is feeling guilty about what happened with his mum. He seems to think that the source of his sadness is the guilt of not fulfilling his mum's request, but in my opinion, that's the wrong conclusion for him to reach. Rather, I believe that the heart of his issues is his inability to accept that running away from that hospital that day was the only honest thing in his entire film. Late into the story, Yuta's father reveals that after Yuta refused to come home to film his mum's death, he instead brought the camera in, and after explaining that Yuta himself wasn't able to come, the mother pauses for a moment, trying to digest this, before finally whispering, "That boy was useless." We're shown a series of panels which paint a very different picture of Yuta's mother. While in the film at the beginning she was kind and playful, here she's totally cold and abusive, using the possibility of her own death as a tool to manipulate her son into doing as she orders. She shows no actual love for him, simply berating him bitterly for every tiny misstep he makes. As we find out, the version of her that Yuta featured in this film was her at her absolute best, and the version we're seeing now is what she was really like. And we realize the person we were introduced to at the beginning never really existed. Rather, it was all a narrative of her that Yuta built up in an attempt to work through the trauma of having a selfish mother who abused and resented him for no reason. And so, as Eeri says, when Yuta runs away from the hospital as it explodes, that's him rebelling against her unreasonable demand, but it's also him going against every selfish thing that his mother stands for, and everything that she put Yuta through, and completely changed our perspective of it from a cowardly act to a really brave one that must have been a huge emotional struggle for him to go through. But for us, finding this out is such a gut punch. So much of the story's foundation was built upon the film that Yuta made, and the idea of a bereaved son struggling to come to terms with his loving mother's death, and the fact that so much of it was false, it really turns the entire story on its head. Our perspective is Yuta's perspective. We are so tied to his understanding of the world that finding out how unreliable that understanding is makes it so that we stop knowing at all if anything in this manga is how it seems. It puts us on uneven footing, so that we're stuck guessing at what even is real and what's being tailored to feed us a specific aspect of the story. It simultaneously makes us feel like we understand Yuta less, but also that we understand him and his struggle so much more, because it gives us a window into how his upbringing has affected the ways that he thinks about himself. Growing up with an emotionally abusive parent means that, in many cases, your understanding of how you are to be treated is shaped by someone who is mistreating you, and this allows them to distort what's right and wrong around them. A child might understand, in the abstract, that their parents' actions are wrong, and if anyone else acted the same way, that child would be appalled. But when their parents do the same to them, then the child can convince themselves that it wasn't so bad, or that they did something to deserve it. And if this abuse happens frequently enough, the child can just start to believe that this is normal or acceptable, and it can grow to the point that they cling to the times when their parent is kind to them as examples that they really are good parents, and the kid can grow to be grateful for when they can even feel safe and loved in their own home. It's never outright stated, but I think this is what's happening with Yuta. Living in that environment and going through the tragedy of losing his mum has really complicated his understanding of her, because she was awful, sure, but he still loves her and misses her so much. She's his mum after all. Coming to terms with who the person he loved the most really was, it would destroy the illusion that he was ever happy, and the idea that his mum ever loved him back. So, by remembering her in that saint-like role, Yuta avoids the painful process of coming to terms with who she really was, but also represses and buries that trauma, keeping it all to himself and never giving himself the chance for any kind of closure. It's so much easier to view a parent like that as a fundamentally good person who just had some occasional blips than it is to tear down your entire perception of them. But it also makes him ignore the awful ways that she made him feel, and potentially prevents him from building up his sense of self-esteem. I think this could be part of why he felt like committing suicide at the beginning. If he already didn't like himself and already felt worthless because of his upbringing, the ways that his class treated him could have been the push that drove him to attempt suicide. Yuta's idealization of his mom may help him in the short term, but in the long term, it's just allowing the problem to fester and eat away at his happiness. But Yuta pays this no mind, and so he and Eeri continue regardless. And one day, as the two are acting out a scene in the movie, Eeri suddenly collapses into the water and ends up being hospitalized. Yuta comes to visit her and tries to cheer her up by making plans with her for when she's better. And slowly, quietly at first, Eeri tells him, "You don't get better. You don't get better. It's not that kind of illness. I knew. I thought I had more time." Eeri tells him that she's dying and that she has one more request for him before she goes. She wants him to film her death and make it part of the movie that he's making, because she wants this film to be her legacy. She wants it to be how people remember her. The scene rests on Eeri as she waits for a response, before Yuta finally stammers out, How can you ask me to do that?" He's completely distraught. Not only is he going to lose his best friend, but that same friend who he trusted in is now telling him that she wants him to do that very same thing that caused him so much pain. How does someone even process that? But eventually, after some well-meaning prompting from his dad, he decides to do it. Just like his movie counterpart, he decides that he wants to help Eeri in this way, and he believes that this is what will bring him closure. We can see that Yuta is coping in his own way with everything that his mother put him through, and the complete outrage that his one act of rebellion provoked among his classmates seems to have led him to believe that action was wrong, and that it's something that he needs to atone for. But in following through with Eeri's wishes, he's only going to cause himself more pain as he's forced to relive his trauma again. But he continues, and we go through another montage, just like at the start, where the two know that Eeri's disease is hanging over their heads constantly, but they still try to make the best of this. They enjoy the time that they both have left, culminating in a really sweet but sad scene where the two reminisce about the film, even as she's slipping away. And at last, as the light starts to fade from her eyes, the screen pans out again to the auditorium as the whole audience begins sobbing uncontrollably. But after the film, a friend of Eeri's comes up to Yuta and tells him that while she really liked the movie, the portrayal of Eeri puzzled her because wasn't Eeri kind of bad-tempered and self-absorbed? Hell, wasn't she kind of an arsehole? To which Yuta agrees that she was. And as the friend points out, didn't Eeri wear glasses normally? And Yuta tells her that they took them off for filming, which Eeri hasn't worn glasses a single time during this comic, meaning that every single scene she's been in has been staged. Though the events they depict did happen, every scene with Eeri in it has been a reenactment, an imitation of an honest interaction. And we start to realize that the version of Eeri who we've been watching and we've grown attached to is just as much a fabrication as Yuta's mother. We realize that from the start, Eeri's been helping Yuta primarily because, as she admits, she loved the way that Yuta filmed his mum so beautifully, and she wanted to be filmed in the exact same way, to leave a legacy, albeit a twisted one, which is completely false and untrue, which leaves out every wrinkle or wart in her personality. The entire time, Yuta's been trying to fulfill Eeri's wish to present a narrative of her as this perfect savior, to erase the person who she really was, so that the only way that people remember her is as this hollowed out, smiling husk. But even then, a lot of Eeri's more selfish qualities still slip through the cracks, seemingly without Yuta even noticing them. In fact, just like in Yuta's film about his mother, the story has been dropping in hints about Eeri's true nature throughout, ones which you really only pick up on reading it for a second time. Because on a first reading, Eeri seems incredibly cool. I mean, she comes into Yuta's life out of nowhere, and gives him some actual purpose by validating him, and letting him know that his work spoke to at least one person. But when you look into what she actually does throughout the story, Eeri is kind of awful, even before she gets Yuta to film her death. Like, let's look at the scene that she's introduced in. She sees this kid, literally about to kill himself, and all she has to say is that he should do it in a place where the doctors are arsehole. There's no attempt to talk him out of it, or to try and help. She seems fine with just leaving him out to die. What kind of person does that? Perhaps you could say that she's trying to get him to go to the other hospital so he'll calm down and realize that suicide isn't the answer. But I doubt that, because she seems just so apathetic towards Yuta's well-being, up to the point where she realizes that she can get something out of him. She shows no concern for the poor kid whatsoever. And throughout the story, she is using him in order to secure some kind of legacy for herself. She uses a vulnerable person for her interests. And as she does this, Eeri acts quite forcefully in order to get Yuta to go along with what she wants, telling him to quit his extracurriculars and saying that he should be honored to be around someone like her. And when you think about it, she's talking to a suicidal person while trying to make him reliant on her by getting him to abandon all of his other interests and to cut him off from anything that gives him meaning in life other than her. And it just feels really manipulative, to be honest. At the same time, it's important to consider that Eeri herself is struggling with a terminal illness, which is obviously unimaginably stressful for her, and it's understandable that she would want to secure a legacy for herself and to cement her memory in the minds of the people that she knew. We never get Eeri's perspective on this, and it isn't confirmed, but I think that it's likely that throughout the story, she was principally motivated by the desperation to make the most of the time that she had left, and her actions can be seen as those of a dying person grasping onto anything that she can do to at least control her legacy. And that doesn't justify anything, but it helps us understand why she acted in the way that she did, and helps us view how she acted as a result of the pressure that she's under and the immense stress that she's dealing with. She may not have been a good person, but she is a character who we can sympathize. Though regardless, she did use Yuta for her own purposes. And as we were talking from Yuta's perspective, it's useful to consider how the narrative presents Eeri's more harmful actions. The whole issue of how Eeri treats Yuta before she realizes who he is, that's completely sidelined and forgotten about, as she whisks him off to her abandoned building and injects new meaning into his life. And the sometimes quite forceful ways in which she acts are played off more as a joke. In other words, we're seeing her as Yuta sees her. The bad is passed over and ignored, while the good is put up front and center. The many nuances and wrinkles that are present in the person of Eeri are all cast off in order to build up this narrative of the cool, mysterious girl who saved Yuta. And this is so clever because it once again puts us in exactly the same position as Yuta. We too ignore Eeri's darker side for most of the story, and we share Yuta's exact distorted perspective on her, both in presentation and storyline. The manga hooks us into seeing this world through this unreliable narrator, and then hits us with how fake it always was. And the fact that so much of this is being told as part of Yuta's student film means that Yuta is using the exact same coping mechanism that he did with his mum. Despite everything, he still loved his mum, and despite how awful Eeri was, she still saved his life and she gave him purpose, and she was still his best friend. How could he not idealize her? But in idealizing her, he never really knows her. He doesn't understand the person that she was. And because of not seeing Eeri fully for everything she was, he's unable to get any kind of closure. For years, he spends his free time re-editing together different versions of the movie from hundreds and hundreds of hours worth of footage that he has of himself and Eeri. From each film is born a different Eeri with a different personality, but one that still only shows a small, biased snippet of the real Eeri. Yuta spends years grappling with this enigma of a person who he can never understand fully. Even as he grows up and gets a family of his own, he still can't tear his mind away from wondering what Eeri means to him. Yet, as he tells us, he was at least content with it. The confusion this has left him in was something that he could distract himself from. He had a family after all. That is, until said family was killed in a traffic accident and he's left all alone again. This pushes him to his breaking point, and he decides that he can't deal with seeing anyone he loves die ever again. So he decides to himself commit suicide. And he decides to do it in the old building that he and Eeri used to hang out in. Even now, the memory of her is something that he cannot shake from his mind. He walks in and picks up his old school bag, only to hear a familiar voice. "You're a lot older than you were back then. It's Eeri. She's alive, somehow." Yuta is obviously completely flabbergasted. How is this possible? Surely this must be some kind of hallucination. But as Eeri reminds him, she's a vampire. Not just in the movie, but in real life too. And though every few hundred years she loses all of her memories, it's still the same her. And this incarnation of her tells him that though it's hard to lose all memory of the people in her life over and over, she's still able to understand the person she was, and the person that Yuta was through his film. The same film that provides only a distorted view of who Eeri was. And this is where I think that my reading of the story diverges from what the actual intention of the story may have been. Reading this, it seems as though the power to choose how you remember someone is held up as a good thing. You won't drown in the despair of knowing that you'll lose everybody and that they will lose you, so long as you can hold the memory of them close to you, and that they can do the same for the memory of you. Eeri will always have the knowledge of Yuta to remind her of her previous life. The manga practically tells you that this is a good thing, when Eeri says that remembering her and Yuta is what's keeping her from depression, and when Yuta agrees that it's a beautiful thing. But I can't conclude that this is a happy ending, because what Eeri is doing here is holding onto a false memory. She isn't watching Eeri and Yuta, she's watching this version of Eeri and Yuta, one of the many fractured pieces that make up these two people who are as complicated and hard to understand as everybody else. And so when she looks at this film, it's so easy for her to go along with Yuta's narrative and to see the previous version of herself as a great person, and prevents her from seeing that there are issues with her that should be addressed so as to make the new version of Eeri a better one. Since she's only seeing this romanticized version of herself and not understanding her faults, she is much less likely to grow as a person, but she doesn't care about the reality of the situation, even when it hurts her. Just like how Yuta didn't care if he was whitewashing others in his mind, because it hurts so much less to imagine those he loves as good people. Eeri tells Yuta that if he's not going to be quiet, then he should really just leave and stop interrupting the movie. And I can't interpret this as anything other than her wanting to drown herself in the past. She has no interest in the real Yuta, the one standing right in front of her, only in this fake version, which is sculpted to characterize him in a not necessarily honest way, and one which positioned her as the savior, and ignores how much real harm she has caused to him. And partially because she's such a mirror image of him, I view this scene as mostly symbolic. I don't think that Yuta here is literally talking to Eeri, or that Eeri is canonically a vampire. I think that this is part of a third film, in which Yuta faces the dilemma of how he's going to cope with all the people he's lost, and how he's supposed to remember them. Eeri here represents his wish to continue sugarcoating everything and dwelling in his past, never really being able to move on. She's the version of Eeri that Yuta has idealized for years, but she's also the boy he used to be, once again inviting him down the self-destructive path and telling him to pretend that there's nothing wrong. And because of this, when Yuta walks out of the building, this time confident and composed, as the entire damn thing explodes behind him, I can't read this as anything other than Yuta casting aside Eeri's influence and his old mindset. When the hospital exploded behind him as he fled from his mother, that was him rebelling against her control over him, and even then he was scared and uncertain. So when he confidently walks out of the abandoned building here, I think that he's going against Eeri in that same way. Even though she's helped him a lot, and even though she didn't intend to hurt him like she did, she has left a looming shadow over all of Yuta's life. Watching someone who's so completely stuck in the past and unable to muster up any interest in the reality of who she is or for the present, I think it represents Yuta seeing what a sinking ship his old thought process was, and of him deciding to take his leave before it can figuratively and literally blow up in his face. But at the same time, it also comes with a reminder that what Eeri says isn't without value. She talks about how she'll fondly remember the time that she and Yuta spent together, and how cherishing the memories of those she's cared for is going to help her feel connected to who she is and soften the blow of losing those she cares for. And I think that it reminds that it's necessary to strike a balance between remembering people and distorting people. You can appreciate someone for what they've done for you and be grateful for those happy moments while also acknowledging their flaws and the way that they've hurt you. You can remember the entire person with all their complexities while not becoming obsessed with who they were to you. Yuta struggled so much with understanding his mother and understanding Eeri. The loss of both of them was something he could never cope with, but establishing and maintaining a healthy understanding of them helps him connect with them and process their deaths in a healthy way. And it's the exact same with his wife and daughter. Yuta went to kill himself so that he wouldn't have to repeat the process of suffering all that he'd already been through. But in truth, he still has the memory of them, which he can hold close to his heart. They, the real versions of themselves, will always be with him. And this short scene in a new but still deeply personal film, I think it represents Yuta's long struggle of coming to understand and internalize this. All of this is only my subjective interpretation of the manga, but I read the story as about the narratives we construct about those we love, and the struggle of actually understanding others. If you've grown to deeply care for someone in your life who turned out to be not the best person, then it can often be so difficult to actually sort through all your conflicting feelings about them. If someone grows to mean the world to you, then how can you lose your fabricated idea of them without losing everything? Often we can distort those people in our minds, only paying attention to the best that they have to offer, just as Yuta does for his mother and for Eeri. We're so emotionally intertwined with those people that it becomes nearly impossible to just step back and view them for who they really are. Eeri wasn't ever an evil person or a monster. She was just kind of a selfish person, and she just happened to enter Yuta's life at a critical moment and accidentally really helped him. And it shows how those narratives can hurt us. Yuta's idealization of his mother left him unable to understand or confront the abuse that he suffered, and consequently he couldn't see the red flags which popped up with Eeri. and that led to him being used all over again. And that's why, whether it was strictly intended by the creator or not, I view the ending as a rejection of Eeri's selfish desire to live on perfectly in the minds of those who knew her. But I don't think that's all. I think that it's also a story about how art can help us to sort through all of these feelings, and how it can help us to derive meaning in our lives from what we've done, instead of from another person. Yuta expresses his confused feelings about his mother throughout the movie, and he does this in a self-destructive manner in many ways, but he still finds a way to talk about those feelings, and not leave them bottled up in his head for years. As much harm as it did to him, creating that film kept Yuta going through some of the darkest times in his life, and it was the idea of creating a truly moving piece of art which motivated Yuta not to commit suicide early on. Eeri sparked that passion up again, sure, but it was creating something beautiful that is the core of what let Yuta keep going in the end. And I think that he's doing the exact same here in this final scene. As an adult, he can turn his struggles into a truly honest film, one that will let him process all of these emotions and spin them into something valuable, both for himself and for whoever else watches it. And it's fitting then that this entire manga proves its own point about the power of art by managing to be such a powerful and beautifully told story, one which I think has the real power to impact the people who read it.